John Kounrud, nisu filos, radit će 30 vite duke marme i teme që son, për sot teme do të përgjigojnë për nesh, që asim që janë apostoli e këtës shqiptarë. Gjona Maria. Hallelujah.
Do kërkoj ndjes ju që flisni shqip se do flas anglisht. So you English speakers, you can take your headphones off now. And I have 50 minutes, an hour and 20, what is it? No. Do we need to stand up? Are we okay? Is everybody, your heads all right? Stretch a little bit? I'll see if we can do this nice and quick. How's that?
Okay.
How's the translator? I've seen 2 die this morning already. They fell over. You're on your last one, I think. Okay? On the 12th of November, 1884, a young Albanian, recently returned from years of study abroad, boarded a carriage in Monastir, which is now Bitola in Macedonia, bound for Korça in southern Albania, and his name is Gerasim Kyrias. He was then 26 years of age, and he was thrilled by the prospect of the task before him. His plan to preach in Albanian in Korça for the very first time okay. Po ai ka tekstin në shqip, se unë nuk kam në shqip. Është për kthyer? Nuk është, ja nuk mundem. Okay. Gerasim was rejoicing in the thought of going on such a blessed errand. He did not know that his life was in danger, and on the road ahead, a large band of brigands lay waiting, watching from the mountains for his carriage to pull into the pass below. Gerasim would spend the next 6 months as a hostage, enduring a brutal trial that nearly cost him his life, and which only ended when his employer, the British and Foreign Bible Society, paid his tormentors a hefty ransom. Once free, another worker might have abandoned their calling or sought to conduct their business from a safe distance far away from the homeland. Gerasim did neither. Instead, he determined once and for all to continue his work among his countrymen. Alexander Thompson, his boss back at the Bible Society's headquarters in Istanbul, described Gerasim's response to this experience as follows. Mr. Kyrias was released, and this trial, from the view it gave him of the social misery of his people, greatly deepened his resolution to work for their evangelization, which he felt to be their only sure remedy. The purpose of my talk is to briefly consider the life and work of Gerasim Kyriasi, not only within the context of the Balkans where he labored, but also in the wider context of the Protestant Reformation as a global phenomenon. Gerasim Kyriasi died in 1894 at the age of 35. Study of him as a subject of interest did not begin until the late 1950s. The first biographical account of his life was written by a flamboyant Albanian historian named Skender Luarasi and was published in Tirana in 1962. Skender was the son of Petronini Luarasi, a well-known Albanian patriot who had been a close friend and co-worker of Gerasim Kyriasi. Luarasi's book was the first thing I read when I started my research into Gerasim's life in the late 1980s, and that was right here in Prishtine. Before moving to Kosovo, I'd spent some years studying in a theological college in Sweden. During that time, I happened to read an article about a country called Albania. I grew up in America and I'd never heard of it before, so I'm sorry, but nobody told me about Albania. I read an article, and this article said that the government of Albania had banned religion and enforced atheism on all of its citizens. Religious expression was regarded as an act against the state. Quite unexpectedly, this moved me deeply, and Albania was back then closed to Americans, unless you were a member of the Communist Party, which I was not. So 30 years ago, last August, my wife and I moved here to Prishtine because Albania was still at that time closed. And from the beginning of my time here, I was interested in exploring the Albanian government's assertion that religion as a force only brings harm to a nation. So, for example, this little book, published in Tirana in 1968 under the title Science and Religion Are Incompatible, Shkenca dhe feja janë të pajtueshme. The introduction of this little book promises great things, solutions to questions men and women have wrestled with down through the ages, and all in a tiny book of 146 pages. It says that the writings collected in this volume, published by our press, deliver a heavy blow to religion. They reveal its anti-scientific and reactionary character. They reveal the purpose behind why religions were created and whose interests they protect. They reveal that all religions have attempted and continue to seek to inject their poison into man's conscience, to paralyze him and to stop him from continuing on the path of progress and to keep him enslaved. All in 146 pages. That's not bad. So it was in this context that I first stumbled across the name of Gerasim Geriazi. Three very different threads came together in a short space of time to reveal a man regarded by Albania's communist regime as a national hero, but who also composed hymns to God and preached the gospel to his people. I wanted to know more, but doubted if I could find much information about an Albanian who had lived and died in the Balkans a century before. Could any documents about him have survived for so long? As it turned out, Gerasim Geriazi is probably one of the best documented Albanians of the entire 19th century. Letters and correspondence, articles and reports, both by him and about him, as well as his published literary output, numbers well into the thousands of pages. And the reason so much still exists today is because the bulk of it survived outside of the Balkans. My challenge to begin with was finding everything and bringing it together. I won't go on about the process of discovery, except to say that these primary source materials reveal a man who was in many ways ahead of his time, full of faith and with a determination to bring change to his nation, whatever the cost. Now, the theme of our conference relates to the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, and there are activities like this one happening across the globe. Last month, I had the privilege of listening to a talk in London by the renowned Oxford historian Alistair McGrath on the life of Martin Luther. And what struck me as I listened was what seemed to me to be a number of similarities between the lives of Luther and Geriazi, and I hadn't thought of it before. For both men, at the core of their experience, they claimed that their lives had been changed forever by a personal experience of God through their reading of Scripture. And it was this experience which led both of them to do things that they never expected to do with their lives. As a result of his activities, Luther was excommunicated from the church he grew up in, though this isn't what he had sought. Gerasim, too, was anathematized by the church of his fathers. Both men dedicated themselves to the vernacular language, preparing texts and publishing in their mother tongues. Both were threatened with violence, and their enemies tried to kill them. And both started churches with services in the vernacular language. But there's one thing in particular which Alistair McGrath said that really struck me, and it was this. Rather than, as is normal, or was it normal at that time in the Christian traditions that Luther came from, rather than expressing his deep devotion to God by withdrawing from the world and entering a monastery, Luther chose instead, as an act of worship, to enter into society and reform it. And it's a theological concept that represents a significant shift away from the traditional church of his day. And we see the same response to his religious experience in the life of Gerasim Kyrios. At its core, in both cases, is revealed a total confidence in the transformative power of Scripture to effect change in the life of the individual. And it was this confidence, this conviction, that led Luther and Kyrios to dedicate themselves to promoting that message in the vernacular so that normal people could engage with it in their everyday lives and hopefully to thus reform the nation. And it's precisely this activity that brought both Luther and Kyrios into serious conflict with the religious and secular authorities of their day. I mentioned Skender Luarasi's biography. I'll skip forward, but I just want to say about his biography is he dealt with Kyrios as a historical subject. I found out when we moved to Albania in 1991 that one of the main motivations that he had as a historian was to try and ease the suffering of the family that were still alive in Albania. So he wanted to retell the story of Gerasim in a way that was acceptable to the communist authorities. The way to do that was he emphasized the secular nature of Gerasim's work and said he wasn't really a man of faith. He was just a social activist. And the book that he wrote ended up being successful. The family were reinstated. The children were allowed to go to school, and a pension was given to one of the two Chiriazi sisters. But this idea of Luarasi's continues to have some weight in Albania and even amongst Albanian scholars, that Chiriazi was never really a believer, but he deceived the Protestant missionaries to help them in his secular cause. And I think at the core of it, it's a misunderstanding of this Protestant nature of Gerasim's thinking. And as I said about Luther didn't withdraw from society, but he entered into society in order to reform it, and saw that as an act of worship. And I think that there's at times a confusion within the Balkans in seeing someone dedicated to God who's also proactive within the context of the secular history. So I just wanted to finish by reading something that Gerasim himself wrote along these lines. His writings are full of material about his faith, his understanding of Scripture, his desire to see his nation change. And this is just one example of something that he wrote. I'll finish with an appeal that he wrote. It was published at great risk to himself in 1892. I don't know if I can read it. Can you read it in Albanian for me? I have it in both languages. Can you come here? We'll start with Albanian. This is this text.
I still read.
Yeah, you can. Maybe it can be just this one.
Yeah. Do daqin të sjellim qytetërim, mirësinë dhe ditë të bardha për Shqipërinë, këto mësime duhet mbjell në çdo zemër, që të di i madhi e i vogli. Ato mësime kanë për të na sjell dashurinë dhe vëllazërinë. Sa ato na mësojnë të duam jo vetëm miqt, por edhe asmët, na bëjnë të jemi të besës në çdo punë, na shpëtojnë nga ankimet dhe nga mëria që gjenden ndërmes tonë dhe na ngasin të vemi mbrodh në çdo punë, të mirë si për vete, kështu edhe për të tjerët.
Është vështirë për një geg flas të sërish në bukë. Kështu. Po, faleminderit. Gerasim wrote about having lamented the fact that so few Albanians know the beauty of the teachings of the gospel, he wrote, "If they are of such value, why should they not be read in Albanian in the Albanian churches? If the Albanians desire to see their country civilized, prosperous, and contented, a knowledge of these teachings is imperative. For it is through them that a feeling of true fellowship is created, sincerity and truth promoted, and the various evils which exist among us removed. He concluded, the immediate necessity of the nation is for paper and pens and a knowledge of its own tongue, without which it is impossible to advance on the right path. Thank you.
Foundational John